ESPN didn't suddenly wake up to Caitlin Clark. They didn't have some basketball epiphany. And they definitely didn't just change their minds. What actually happened was much more uncomfortable. Because for months, the story around Caitlin Clark had already been written, and it wasn't written in her favor. The takes were locked in, the framing was set, and the loudest voices in sports media had already decided what kind of rookie she was allowed to be. But then the game itself ruined the plan. Quietly at first, then loudly, then so undeniably that pretending not to see it became impossible. And when that happened, the entire tone at ESPN shifted almost overnight. Analysts who had once minimized her impact suddenly couldn't stop praising her. Highlights that used to feel like afterthoughts were suddenly everywhere. The same people who hesitated to crown her earlier were now calling her a problem for the league. That flip didn't happen by accident. It happened because the narrative collapsed under pressure. Pressure from numbers, from wins, from fans, and from one moment on live television that exposed just how silent some voices had become when Caitlin Clark started dominating. And that moment forced ESPN into a corner. Because once the audience notices the silence, you can't talk your way out of it anymore. You can only pivot. Fast. But to understand why that pivot mattered so much, and why so many fans felt insulted watching it happen, you have to go back to the very beginning. Back to when the season hadn't even played out yet, but the media had already picked its favorite story. And that's where everything started to go wrong. Long before Caitlin Clark ever adjusted to the speed of the WNBA. Long before Indiana started winning games. Long before the Fever even looked like a playoff team. The Rookie of the Year conversation was already framed. Not debated. Not questioned. Framed. From the very start, much of the national conversation wasn't about what Caitlin Clark would do. It was about what she supposedly wouldn't do. Wouldn't defend well enough. Wouldn't translate efficiently. Wouldn't elevate a struggling roster the way fans expected. Wouldn't win enough games for her impact to count. And that last part mattered more than people realized. Because early on, several ESPN analysts made it clear that individual dominance wasn't the deciding factor for them. Team record was. Standings were. Impact was defined through wins, not gravity. Through playoff positioning, not defensive attention. Through plus-minus spreadsheets, not what actually happened when Clark stepped on the floor. Angel Reese, playing on a more competitive roster early, fit that framing perfectly. She became the safe pick, the responsible pick, the grown woman numbers pick. And Caitlin Clark? She became the question mark. You could hear it in the tone. Not outright dismissal, something more subtle. A hesitation. A constant but. Yes, she could score, but what about efficiency? Yes, she could pass, but could she run a team? Yes, she could draw attention, but was she really helping Indiana win? Those doubts weren't coming from nowhere, but they were being repeated long before the evidence was complete. And once those talking points are on TV, they don't just disappear. They shape how audiences interpret everything that follows. Every off-shooting night becomes confirmation. Every Fever loss becomes proof. Every adjustment period becomes a red flag. Meanwhile, the same grace wasn't always extended in the opposite direction. Angel Reese's physicality, rebounding dominance, and double-double streaks were celebrated, and rightfully so, but they were also insulated from criticism. The team context mattered when it helped. It disappeared when it didn't. This wasn't a conspiracy. It was something more common. Comfort. Media narratives don't like uncertainty. They like stability. They like stories that can be told early and maintained all season long. And once a narrative feels right, it takes a lot to undo it, especially if undoing it means admitting you might have been early or wrong. So when analysts publicly leaned toward Reese early, they weren't just making a prediction. They were planting a flag. And that flag created expectations not just for the award race, but for how Caitlin Clark herself would be evaluated every single night. She wasn't just playing defenders anymore. She was playing the story built around her. And the irony? That narrative was built on team success, before Indiana ever had time to find itself. The Fever were adjusting to a new system. New roles. A rookie point guard who demanded constant attention. Chemistry that hadn't formed yet. And instead of treating that like a process, it became a measuring stick. Clark wasn't just expected to be great. She was expected to fix everything instantly. And when she didn't, when Indiana stumbled early, when the offense looked disjointed, when the wins didn't come right away, it validated the story ESPN had already told, at least for a while. Because while the narrative stayed comfortable, the reality on the court was starting to shift. And that shift would soon make the early framing impossible to defend. But not everyone noticed it right away. And that delay would end up being the most damaging part of all. The thing about narratives is that they only survive as long as reality cooperates. And at first, reality gave ESPN just enough cover. Indiana wasn't winning consistently. The offense looked rushed. Caitlin Clark was seeing defensive pressure she'd never faced before. Traps at half court, hedges that came early, helped defenders shading her before she even touched the ball. For a while, it looked like the league had figured her out. But that was the surface-level read. What was actually happening underneath was something very different. Because while the box scores didn't always scream dominance early on, Clark was learning the speed of the league in real time. Not through film sessions. Not through practice reps. Through live possessions where every defender on the floor was keying in on her movement. She wasn't just being guarded. She was being hunted. And that accelerated everything. The WNBA doesn't ease rookies in, especially not ones with this much attention. Clark wasn't allowed to feel the game out slowly. She had to process coverages instantly, recognize rotations before they happened, and learn which risks the league would punish and which ones it wouldn't. And once that adjustment started clicking, the shift was impossible to ignore. It didn't show up all at once. It came in flashes. A pass that arrived half a second earlier. A defender frozen by a hesitation that used to work in college. A trap punished with a skip pass instead of a forced shot. The game slowed down for her. And when that happens to a player with her vision, everything around her speeds up. Suddenly, Indiana's spacing made sense. Teammates who looked out of rhythm early were now catching the ball in their shooting pocket. Cuts that used to go unseen were now being rewarded. And defenses that had overcommit to stopping Clark started paying for it possession after possession. But here's the part that didn't get enough attention early. Clark didn't adjust by shooting more. She adjusted by controlling more. Her scoring stayed dangerous, but her manipulation of defenses became lethal. She wasn't forcing hero shots to prove a point. She was bending coverages until they broke, drawing two defenders just to free a shooter, pulling bigs higher and higher until the lane collapsed behind them. And quietly, Indiana started winning different kinds of possessions. Cleaner possessions. Smarter possessions. Possessions that looked intentional. The Fever didn't suddenly become elite overnight, but they stopped looking lost. And once that happened, the wins started to follow, not in fluky bursts but in patterns. Strong second halves. Controlled tempo late in games. Fewer empty trips when the pressure was on. Clark was no longer reacting to the league. She was dictating it. And that's when the numbers changed. Efficiency ticked up. Assist totals climbed. Turnovers dropped as reads sharpened. The same things critics had questioned earlier, decision-making, pace, shot selection, were now becoming strengths. But what made this stretch even more uncomfortable for the early narrative was how it was happening. Indiana wasn't winning because Clark was being hidden. They weren't protecting her with a simplified role. They were putting the ball in her hands and letting her run the entire offense. Every possession ran through her gravity. Defenses had to choose. Blitz her and give up clean looks elsewhere, or stay home and watch her pick them apart. And either choice led to the same result, control. This wasn't empty production. This was impact. The kind that doesn't always show up immediately in standings, but absolutely shows up on film. The kind coaches notice. The kind opposing players feel. The kind that changes how teams prepare days in advance. And as this version of Caitlin Clark started to emerge, something strange was happening on the media side. The clips were still coming. The highlights were still there. The numbers were getting harder to argue. But the conversation wasn't matching the shift. There was no urgency to update the narrative. No rush to revisit earlier conclusions. No acknowledgement that what was happening now didn't align with what had been said before. Instead, the coverage stalled. And in sports media, silence during a surge is never accidental. Because praising Clark now would mean revisiting why she wasn't praised earlier. It would mean explaining what changed, or admitting that the evaluation was premature. And that's a harder conversation than simply waiting. Waiting to see if the hot stretch cools off. Waiting to see if Indiana slips again. Waiting for the story to correct itself. But the correction never came. Clark didn't slow down. Indiana didn't fade. And the Fever didn't look like a fluke anymore. They looked like a team that had found its engine. And with every game, the gap between the narrative and reality widened, until it became impossible to ignore. Fans saw it. Opponents felt it. And eventually, someone on live television said what everyone else had been thinking. And that's when the quiet became the story. There's a difference between being wrong and being quiet. Being wrong invites debate. Silence invites suspicion. And as Caitlin Clark's game started reaching a new level, that silence became impossible to miss. This wasn't the early season noise fading as storylines evolved. This was something more specific. Analysts who had confidently framed the Rookie of the Year race earlier were suddenly nowhere to be found when Clark was doing the exact things she was told she couldn't do. She was controlling games. She was lifting teammates. She was turning a struggling franchise into a playoff threat. And yet, the volume dropped. Shows that once had strong opinions now danced around the topic. Segments that could have centered on Clark shifted focus elsewhere. Praise, when it came, was cautious. Temporary. Carefully worded. Not wrong, just restrained. And restraint in sports media is rarely neutral. Fans noticed the timing immediately. They weren't just watching Caitlin Clark dominate. They were watching who wasn't talking about it. Social media filled the gap that television left open. Clips were shared. Stats were posted. Screenshots of earlier takes resurfaced. People weren't asking for apologies. They were asking for consistency. If team record mattered early, why didn't context matter now? If efficiency mattered then, why didn't improvement matter now? If impact was the standard, why wasn't it being discussed? Those questions hung in the air while the broadcast stayed measured. And the longer that stretch lasted, the worse it looked. Because silence isn't passive when the evidence is loud. Clark was posting assist numbers that forced defenses to rethink coverage. She was creating advantages before she even crossed half court. Indiana's offense didn't just function, it flowed. The chemistry between Clark and her teammates was visible, repeatable, and growing. This wasn't one highlight that could be dismissed as a hot night. This was sustained control. And still, the conversation lagged. Part of that came down to optics. Admitting the shift would mean admitting the original framing didn't hold up. It would mean acknowledging that early season standings had distorted evaluation. It would mean revisiting the very logic that had been used to justify other candidates. That's not an easy pivot on national television. So instead, the safer move was to wait. Wait until the sample size was undeniable. Wait until public pressure forced the topic. Wait until someone else said it first. But that waiting created a vacuum, and vacuums always get filled. Fans began connecting dots. The absence itself became the headline. Comment sections stopped talking about Clark's stat lines and started talking about coverage patterns. People weren't debating basketball anymore. They were debating credibility. Why were certain voices loud when Clark struggled, but muted when she thrived? Why did praise suddenly come with qualifiers? Why did it feel like recognition was being rationed? Those questions don't go away on their own. They build momentum. And once that momentum crosses into mainstream awareness, it's no longer just a fan complaint. It becomes a reputational issue. That's when the quiet became dangerous. Because sports media thrives on authority. Analysts don't just describe the game, they frame how it's understood. And when that framing appears selective, the trust erodes fast. ESPN wasn't losing viewers. They were losing control of the conversation. And that loss of control reached a tipping point on live television, when someone who wasn't even part of the WNBA debate decided to call it out directly. No stats. No spreadsheets. No subtlety. Just a blunt question that cut through the silence. And once that question was asked, there was no going back to business as usual. Because you can't pretend you didn't hear it. The moment didn't come with a warning. There was no dramatic buildup. No viral tease. No segment intro promising controversy. It happened the way the most uncomfortable truths usually do. Suddenly, and in front of an audience that wasn't ready for it. Shannon Sharpe wasn't breaking down film. He wasn't running advanced metrics. He wasn't even talking about Caitlin Clark directly at first. He was talking about silence. And that's what made it hit. Because everyone watching knew exactly who he was referring to, even though he never said a name. The pause before he spoke. The way he framed the thought. The emphasis on who used to have a lot to say. And who suddenly didn't. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't playful. It was pointed. He called out the absence, not the opinion. And in doing that, he exposed something far more uncomfortable than a bad take, selective engagement. The studio energy shifted immediately. This wasn't a debate segment. There was no counterpoint ready. No graphic to pivot to. just an awkward stillness that followed the question. Because once someone asks why certain voices went quiet, there's no clean answer that doesn't raise more questions. Sharpe didn't accuse anyone outright. He didn't have to. By saying less, he forced everyone else to think more. About timing, about consistency, about what it looks like when confidence disappears the moment a player proves you wrong. And the reason that moment mattered so much is because of who Shannon Sharpe is. He wasn't part of the WNBA media ecosystem. He wasn't invested in Rookie of the Year debates or internal league politics. He didn't need to protect relationships or narratives that had been building all season. He was an outsider calling something out that insiders couldn't or wouldn't. That gave the moment weight. Because when criticism comes from within a circle, it's easy to dismiss it as bias or rivalry. But when it comes from someone with nothing to gain, it lands differently. It sounds less like an opinion and more like an observation. And Sharpe's observation was simple. Y'all were loud early. Now you're quiet. That was it. No qualifiers. No softening language. No escape hatch. The reaction online was immediate. Clips spread faster than anything Clark had done on the court that week. Fans didn't need context. They had lived it. They'd noticed the same thing. Sharpe just said it on the biggest stage possible. And once that clip circulated, the silence stopped being invisible. It became the story. Because now, the question wasn't whether Caitlin Clark was playing well. That had already been settled. The question was why the acknowledgement lagged behind the performance, and who benefited from that delay. From that point on, every segment felt different. Any future praise would be scrutinized. Any shift in tone would be questioned. Any highlight package would be read as a response, not analysis. Sharpe hadn't just criticized. He'd forced accountability into the conversation. And ESPN had to react. Not publicly. Not with statements or apologies. But with something far more revealing. A sudden change in energy. Because within days, the same voices that had been cautious were suddenly enthusiastic. Clark's court vision was being celebrated. Indiana was being labeled dangerous. Her impact was no longer theoretical. It was obvious. The pivot was unmistakable. And that pivot raised an even bigger question. Was this recognition or damage control? Because when praise arrives only after pressure, it doesn't feel like discovery. It feels like surrender. The shift didn't come with an explanation. There was no moment where anyone said, "We need to revisit this." No acknowledgement that earlier takes might have missed something. No pause to reset the conversation. It just changed. One week, Caitlin Clark was still being discussed with caution. The next, she was suddenly being framed as a problem for the entire league. Indiana wasn't just improving anymore. They were dangerous. Her passes weren't risky. They were brilliant. Her influence wasn't developing. It was already here. The language flipped almost overnight. What made it jarring wasn't the praise itself. The praise was deserved. Anyone watching the games could see that. What unsettled people was the absence of accountability. The way the new tone arrived, as if it had always been there. That's not how analysis usually works. Analysts typically walk viewers through evolution. They explain growth. They point to adjustments. They say why something changed. But this time, the why was skipped entirely. Clark didn't just become elite in a vacuum. She hadn't been mediocre the week before. The performance had been building, and so had the evidence. Yet the coverage acted as if this version of Caitlin Clark had appeared out of nowhere. Suddenly, segments focused on her vision, her pace, her chemistry with Aaliyah Boston. The behind-the-back passes that had always been there were now proof of genius instead of flash. Indiana's offense was no longer chaotic. It was sophisticated. The story caught up to the reality. But it did so without admitting it had been behind. And that's where the frustration came from. Fans weren't upset that Clark was finally getting credit. They were upset that the earlier framing was being erased instead of addressed. As if the skepticism had never existed. As if the hesitation hadn't shaped weeks of coverage. That kind of rewrite doesn't sit well with audiences who've been paying attention. Because people remember the tone. They remember the doubt. They remember who was hesitant and who wasn't. And when that memory clashes with sudden enthusiasm, it creates distrust. It started to feel less like recognition and more like correction under pressure. Especially when the praise hit all the same beats critics had dismissed earlier. Her assists were now elite. Her decision-making was now veteran level. Her impact on teammates was suddenly undeniable. None of that was new. What was new was the willingness to say it out loud. And the timing made it impossible to ignore. This pivot didn't happen during a quiet stretch. It happened right after the public callout, right after the silence was highlighted, right after fans started questioning credibility instead of stat lines, which made the praise feel reactive, not proactive. That distinction matters, because when analysis leads, it shapes understanding. When it follows, it looks like survival. And ESPN, in that moment, looked like it was catching up, not guiding the conversation. That's why every compliment was dissected. Every segment was watched closely, not for what was said, but for what wasn't. There was no acknowledgement of the early emphasis on team record. No reflection on how context was weighed differently at different points in the season. No explanation for why Clark's impact suddenly mattered more now than it did before. It was as if the season had been rewritten in real time. And once viewers sense that, they stop listening passively. They start reading between the lines. Which leads to a much bigger question, one that goes beyond Caitlin Clark herself. Was this about basketball, or about managing perception? Because when narratives flip without explanation, it suggests the story was never anchored to performance alone. And that brings us to the most uncomfortable part of this entire situation. At a certain point, praise stops being about the player. It becomes about the people giving it. That's where this conversation landed after the pivot. Because if Caitlin Clark had earned this recognition, and she had, then the obvious question became, why now? Why did the tone shift only after the silence was exposed? Why did acknowledgement arrive only when ignoring it was no longer an option? Those questions didn't come from haters. They came from viewers who had been watching closely all along. And the answers weren't comfortable. Sports media loves to frame itself as reactive to the game. We call it like we see it. We adjust as the season evolves. That's the standard defense. But that explanation only works when the evolution is acknowledged. Here it wasn't. There was no bridge between skepticism and praise. No moment of recalibration. No transparent admission that earlier frameworks didn't hold up under new evidence. Instead, the coverage jumped from hesitation to celebration. That kind of jump creates a credibility gap. And once that gap opens, everything gets questioned. Not just this take, but future ones too. Because viewers aren't just consuming content anymore, they're tracking patterns. They noticed that Clark's praise intensified at the exact moment public pressure peaked. When social media clips of the call-out circulated. When comment sections turned critical. When silence became reputationally risky. That timing wasn't lost on anyone, which made the recognition feel strategic. Not in a conspiratorial sense, but in a human one. No outlet wants to look out of touch. No analyst wants to be remembered for missing the biggest story in the league. And no network wants its credibility questioned during a moment of growth for the sport. So the safest move wasn't to double down. It was to pivot. And pivots are easier when you don't explain them. Because explanations invite scrutiny. They invite follow-ups. They invite accountability. They invite someone to ask, then why didn't this matter earlier? By skipping that step, the coverage smoothed the transition, but at the cost of trust. Which is why fans didn't celebrate the praise the way they normally would. It felt overdue. It felt defensive. It felt like the narrative had been forced to catch up rather than organically updated. That's not Caitlin Clark's fault. It's the consequence of how stories are managed when they start slipping out of control. And this situation revealed something bigger than one Rookie of the Year race. It exposed how fragile media authority really is. Because the moment the audience realizes it can spot the lag between performance and recognition, the illusion breaks. Viewers stop accepting takes as guidance and start treating them as positioning. Who's speaking now and why? What changed and who noticed first? What's being emphasized and what's being avoided? Those questions don't disappear once praise begins. They linger. And they followed every segment that came after. Especially as Caitlin Clark's impact expanded beyond box scores and into something ESPN couldn't ignore even if it wanted to. Because this wasn't just about wins anymore. It was about attention. And attention is the one currency sports media cannot afford to misread. At some point, the debate stopped being theoretical. It stopped being about efficiency curves, usage rates, or whether a rookie was ready. It stopped being about what might happen if things broke right. Because the effects of Caitlin Clark were no longer subtle. They were measurable. Everywhere. Road arenas that used to have empty sections were suddenly packed when Indiana came to town. Ticket prices spiked. Broadcast numbers jumped. Social media engagement exploded, not just on highlights, but on entire possessions, assists, reactions, and moments that didn't even end in a shot. People weren't just watching Caitlin Clark score. They were watching her control games. That distinction matters, because scorers come and go. But players who dictate attention change ecosystems. They pull focus whether they're shooting or not. They make everyone else more visible simply by sharing the floor. Indiana felt that immediately. Teammates who had played in relative anonymity were now featured in clips circulating nationally. Role players were becoming recognizable because Clark found them in rhythm. Post players were getting easier looks because help defenders couldn't leave the perimeter. Shooters were stepping into cleaner shots because defensive rotations were late. The offense didn't just run through Clark. It expanded because of her. And that expansion showed up in ways the early narrative never accounted for. Wins mattered now, but so did watchability, relevance, urgency. When Clark played, people tuned in. That's not hype. That's reality. The WNBA has always had stars, but Clark introduced something different. A sense that any possession could turn into something worth rewinding. A pass that arrives from an angle no one expected. A pull-up that forces the defense to overreact. A manipulation of space that feels intentional instead of improvised. And as that style took hold, the league felt bigger. Which put ESPN in an impossible position. Because you can debate awards. You can debate efficiency. You can debate narrative framing. But you can't debate attention. And attention was tilting heavily in one direction. When Clark's games started driving conversation regardless of opponent, the idea of downplaying her impact became untenable. Not just because it looked wrong, but because it was bad business. Media coverage doesn't exist in a vacuum. It follows demand. And the demand was clear. Fans weren't asking for Caitlin Clark content. They were creating it. Clips were being shared faster than broadcasts could produce them. Moments were being analyzed by people who didn't even watch the league regularly. Comment sections filled with new viewers asking questions, learning names, and choosing sides. Clark wasn't just growing the fever. She was growing the audience. That's when the conversation changed permanently. Because once a player becomes a gateway, the reason people show up, ignoring her stops being an option. It becomes a risk, a disconnect, a liability. And that reality reshaped everything. Praise wasn't optional anymore. Coverage wasn't discretionary. The narrative had to catch up, or be left behind. Which is why the pivot felt inevitable. Not because opinions changed, but because the environment did. Clark didn't force recognition with words. She forced it by making herself unavoidable. And once that happened, the conversation around her stopped being just about basketball. It became about power. Who gets to decide which stories matter? Who sets the tone for what impact really means? And what happens when the audience decides before the analysts do? Those questions don't just affect one player. They reshape the entire league. And they set the stage for a narrative war that was never really about Caitlin Clark versus Angel Reese, but about what the WNBA wants to be seen as. This was never just about one rookie season. It was about what kind of story the league, and the media covering it, wanted to tell. Caitlin Clark and Angel Reese didn't just enter the WNBA as players. They entered as symbols. And once that happens, basketball stops being evaluated on a clean slate. Every performance gets filtered through meaning. Angel Reese represented toughness, physicality, and traditional dominance in the paint. Her game translated easily into existing WNBA frameworks. Rebounding, interior presence, blue-collar production. She fit a narrative the league already understood and knew how to celebrate. Caitlin Clark didn't fit as cleanly. Her game disrupted pacing. It pulled defenders into uncomfortable space. It forced teams to defend farther from the basket than they wanted to. It centered around decision-making, vision, and long-range threat rather than physical control. That difference mattered. Because leagues don't just market talent, they market identity. And Clark's style challenged long-standing storytelling habits. It blurred lines between women's basketball and the kind of spacing-heavy, perimeter-driven game casual fans were already familiar with from elsewhere. That crossover brought attention, but it also brought tension. Some embraced it immediately. Others resisted it quietly. Not out of malice, but out of instinct. When something changes how a sport is perceived, there's always a push and pull between evolution and preservation. That push and pull showed up everywhere. In how awards were framed. In which stats were emphasized. In what kind of impact was valued. Physical dominance felt safer. Process-driven control felt harder to explain, so the narratives leaned toward what was familiar. But familiarity doesn't always win when the product itself is changing. Clark's presence accelerated that change. Her games didn't just look different, they felt different. Faster, more open, more improvisational. And for new viewers, that mattered. They weren't comparing her to WNBA history. They were comparing her to excitement. And that comparison reshaped the conversation whether the league wanted it to or not. Which is why the Clark versus Reese framing became so intense. It wasn't just a rivalry. It was a proxy battle over direction. Do you reward what the league has always valued? Or do you adapt to what's pulling people in now? That tension didn't come from the players. It came from the ecosystem around them. From analysts trying to balance legacy with momentum. From networks navigating optics. From fans interpreting every take as a signal. And once that tension reached critical mass, neutrality became impossible. Every word was read as alignment. Every omission as intention. Every pivot as positioning. Which is why ESPN's early framing mattered so much, and why the later flip felt so loaded. Because it wasn't just changing an opinion. It was choosing which future to lean into. And the uncomfortable truth is this. Once Caitlin Clark proved she could win and attract attention and elevate others, the debate was no longer sustainable. The game itself had moved forward, and the narrative had no choice but to follow. That doesn't mean the conflict disappears. It means the stakes get higher. Because next season, Clark won't be adjusting anymore. She'll be setting the pace. And when that happens, the pressure on media coverage won't ease. It will intensify. Which brings us to what happens next. What happened this season wasn't a one-off. It was a preview. Because Caitlin Clark didn't just survive her rookie year. She recalibrated expectations. And once that happens, the margin for misreading her again gets much smaller. Next season won't come with the same excuses. There won't be talk about adjustment periods or learning curves. There won't be patience for wait and see. The league will know exactly who she is, and so will the audience. Which means the pressure shifts. Defenses will load up earlier. Game plans will be built around limiting her before she touches the ball. Physicality will increase. Coverage schemes will get more aggressive. And Clark will still be the focal point. Because she's already shown she can adapt faster than narratives can. That's why the media flip won't be the last one. As her game evolves, the conversation around her will have to keep up or risk falling behind again. And every delay will be more noticeable than the last. If she wins a playoff series, the framing changes immediately. If she pushes a contender, the language shifts again. If she starts a season hot, the MVP discussion won't be theoretical anymore. And with each escalation, the tolerance for hesitation shrinks. Because audiences remember. They remember who was early. They remember who waited. They remember who resisted until resistance wasn't viable. That memory shapes trust. And trust is what sports media trades on more than anything else. Which puts networks like ESPN in a bind. They can't afford to underestimate her again. But they also can't afford to look like they're chasing momentum instead of leading analysis. So the coverage will get louder. More decisive. More definitive. But it will also be scrutinized. Every strong take will be compared to earlier caution. Every compliment weighed against past silence. Every narrative shift treated as a test. And that scrutiny won't fade. Because Caitlin Clark has already shown she's not slowing down. Indiana is still young. Still growing. Still far from its ceiling. And Clark isn't even close to hers. Her command of the game will sharpen. Her chemistry will deepen. Her influence will spread further across the floor. Which means the conversation around her will keep evolving, whether analysts are ready or not. And next time, there won't be room to wait quietly. The audience won't allow it. The game won't allow it. And the silence that once protected narratives will only make things louder when it breaks. Which brings us to the final truth of this entire situation. You can shape a story early. You can delay recognition. You can even control the conversation for a while. But you can't control reality forever. In the end, this wasn't about Caitlin Clark proving anyone wrong. It was about reality outpacing the story that had been built around her. The game moved faster than the narrative. Faster than the early evaluations. Faster than the comfort of familiar framing. And once that gap opened, everything that followed was inevitable. ESPN didn't lead the shift. They reacted to it. Not because they wanted to, but because they had to. Clark didn't ask for recognition. She didn't campaign for it. She didn't respond to the noise. She just kept making the next read, the next pass, the next decision that forced defenses and conversations to adjust. And when that adjustment finally happened on television, it exposed something bigger than one award race. It showed how fragile control really is in modern sports media. You can shape a narrative early. You can lean into what feels safe. You can delay acknowledgement when the evidence makes you uncomfortable. But eventually, the game speaks louder than the coverage. Fans noticed the silence. They noticed the pivot. And they noticed how quickly the tone changed once pretending wasn't an option anymore. That doesn't mean every take was malicious. It means the system favors stability until instability becomes impossible to ignore. Caitlin Clark made ignoring her impossible. Not just with stats, not just with wins, but by changing how the league looks, feels, and is consumed. And this won't be the last time that happens. Because as long as performance keeps forcing the conversation forward, narratives will keep scrambling to catch up. And the next flip might come even faster than the last. So the real question isn't whether Caitlin Clark has arrived. It's who's ready to keep up when she goes even further. And if you want to stay ahead of the media shifts before they happen, not after, make sure you're subscribed. Because the next narrative collapse is already loading.